he tells us that it burst through the doors of the Commons. They had to remove the door frames to get it in. And again, that is true. If you look at the size of the doors and you look at the pictures of what the petition in its boxes looked like, the only way to get it through was to remove the door jambs and the doors and get it through into the Commons like that. So absolutely incredible scenes.
Hello, I'm Natalie from Genealogy Stories, and welcome to Twice Removed, the show where we talk about everything history related. I'd like to welcome my guest today, history researcher, Chartist expert and creator of the Chartist Ancestors website. Hi Mark, how are you?
Hi, very well, thanks. Good to be here.
I just realised I didn't say your full name. It's Mark Crail. I just assume everybody knows you because you're so knowledgeable about Chartism.
Oh yes, I'm a legend in my own household.
Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm not going to assume people have any prior knowledge, because when I told my dad I was interviewing somebody about Chartism, he said, "What is Chartism?" So I thought the best place to start would be what is Chartism and who were the Chartists?
Okay, so well, essentially Chartism was Britain's democracy movement. If you go back to the 1830s, probably everyone who's done sort of history O-level or GCSE or beyond will have come across the 1832 Reform Act, the Great Reform Act that sort of essentially is supposed to put Britain on this route to democracy. Only really that wasn't the way it seemed at the time, because although the Reform Act did sort of tidy things up and standardise the franchise and put the Whigs into power and all the rest of it, it left 9 out of 10 men and all women without the vote.
Okay.
So as you go through the 1830s, then there's an awful lot of dissatisfaction about that, particularly from those people who'd mobilised behind the campaign to get this 1832 Reform Act through, and then found themselves excluded from any possibility of a voice in government or whatever themselves. You get policies coming out of that, particularly the New Poor Law, so the workhouses, which absolutely horrified many of the people who'd been behind the campaign for a wider vote in 1832. But it was a Whig government that got in as a result of it that was implementing all this stuff. You've got increasing economic hardship through the 1830s, and so there are all sorts of dissatisfactions in different parts of the country, in different groups of people, and by the end of the 1830s, that's all sort of building and building and building, and then the charter itself, the People's Charter, as it was known, almost comes as an afterthought. It didn't really come out of that. This came from a group called the London Working Men's Association, which was a group of sort of artisan radicals who talked nicely to a few radical MPs that there were, and had nice discussions and so forth. And towards the end of the 1830s, they decided they would publish this thing called the People's Charter, and it brought together these 6 points, these 6 demands. And those 6 demands weren't anything new. They'd been around since at least the 1780s, but they formed a focus. And gradually things fell into place behind the demand for these 6 great reforms. And we end up with a huge petition. We end up with all sorts of activities going on behind that brings it all together into an enormous movement by the end of the 1830s, something that had never been seen before in this country. So that's how it all kicks off anyway.
It's really interesting actually, because I'd never really thought about the New Poor Law in that context before. That obviously people were horrified by the workhouses and terrified of going into the workhouses, and then of course they didn't vote to have the workhouses, so it really was outside their control. But I think sometimes you forget that. So what were the 6 points on the charter?
I knew you were going to ask me that. It's like being asked to name the 7 dwarfs, you know. There's always one at the end that you can't remember what it was. So okay, so the 6 points were, first of all, the vote for all men over the age of 21. I say men, I'm sure we'll come back to that point. vote for all men over 21. The secret ballot. So up to this point, when you voted, if you voted in public. People knew who you voted for.
It can be really interesting if you do manage to find an ancestor that voted. I found one for a client recently, and it was wonderful because I was able to tell them that A, they owned enough property to vote, but secondly, who they voted for and what their policies were, which tells you an awful lot about your ancestor, really. So,
That's absolutely really useful for family historians.
But not so much if you want to vote and not, not so much for democracy, but
if you wanted to vote in a different way to your employer or your landlord, it might not be a great thing. So that's the second one of the demands. So it's the right to vote, the right to vote in secret. There are equal electoral districts. This idea that actually everyone should have a more or less equal say in Parliament. So you can't have one constituency which has 1,000 voters and another which has 100,000 voters, because that gives you a really unequal say in Parliament. So they wanted equal-ish electoral districts. They wanted to abolish the property qualification to be an MP. You had to own quite a bit of property or have quite an income to be eligible to be an MP in those days. They wanted to open this up to everyone, essentially. And it was an issue. There were a number of MPs, people who were elected to Parliament right up through the 1840s, 1850s even, who were subsequently disqualified and kicked out of Parliament because they weren't rich enough.
Really? Did you get people almost sponsoring them, like giving them the money or the entitlement in order to get them to the point where they could be an MP?
Yeah, there was lots of sort of shifting around of paper money, stuff that didn't really exist, and the sort of the ownership in quotes of particular properties.
Okay.
And obviously their opponents were keen to uncover that sort of thing, and if it wasn't a genuine thing, that election would be challenged. So yeah, people did do their best to ensure that they looked wealthy enough, even if they weren't. I've forgotten how many days.
I was going to say, is the next one that MPs get paid?
Yes, that's number 5, payment for MPs. One of the last ones to come into effect, actually. It didn't happen until the 20th century. And again, it's about ensuring that you don't have to be rich to be in Parliament. And people often these days look at MPs as, awful lot of money for doing nothing, whatever. But actually, probably the lesser of the evils. If you could only be in Parliament if you were wealthy enough to sustain yourself, then that really does limit the pool of people who can go into Parliament.
Is there an argument that it also it means you're less likely to be subject to bribery? If you're earning a decent income from being an MP, then you're less likely to be able to be bribed to put in the laws that somebody else wants that's wealthy.
Absolutely, yeah. You're on the state payroll or the people's payroll. You're not on the payroll of Lord whatever or other, who has a string of 5 MPs who always vote the way he wants them to or whatever.
No comment.
In principle, in theory. That's 5, and the 6th one, the one that often gets forgotten, is because it's the only one which hasn't actually been implemented, is annual parliaments.
Okay.
So they thought there should be a general election every year.
Wow, that would be a lot. So actually now we do all except for the last one. We now do, and though obviously I'm guessing they came in at different times and not all together.
They did. It took a long time, and I think the first one was the abolition of the property qualification, which I think was towards the end of the 1850s.
Okay.
Then that right to vote, which comes in gradually through the late 19th, early 20th century.
Okay, so going back to the very first point on the charter, then that all men should get the vote. Why didn't they include women?
A very good question. William Lovett, who was the person who drafted the charter, if you like, he was a well-known London radical, was involved all through the sort of 1820s through to the 1840s in radicalism and so forth. He says in his memoirs that he did initially include in it the right for all people to vote, men and women over 21, but was persuaded that this was a step too far. That it would undermine the credibility of the of the charter and reduce the support for it. So it sort of almost made it in, but came out at the last minute before it got to a wider audience. Despite that, it wasn't massively contentious at the time, but there were definitely voices. There were people who were in favour of the vote for women as well as for men. Both male activists within the Chartist movement and a number of women in Charters who were active in Chartism at all levels. The Chartism involved women in grassroots campaigns. There were women speakers and so forth. There's a journalist called Helen Macfarlane who worked for a paper right at the end of the sort of mass Chartist period, 1848, 1849, who was the first person to translate the Communist Manifesto into English. A great legacy of that. The first person to do it. And in fact, she was about the only person that Marx and Engels, who were in the UK at the time, in Chartism, had any time for. They thought she was the only one with any original thought in the entire movement. So yeah, women were involved. I think the other thing to remember is over that period as well, and that sort of from the end of the Georgian period through into the Victorian era, the whole idea of separate spheres for men and women, which has always been there to an extent, but it really gains ground. And women and men are separated out. Politics is a men's thing. And it goes through from the workplace. So you've got various factory acts which differently regulate the hours that men and women and children are allowed to work. Mines Acts, obviously, which exclude women from coal mining and so forth. And where Chartism at the very beginning was in some senses a sort of community thing. And you get these great outdoor rallies, particularly up in Lancashire on the moors, and they involve whole families. And there's a wonderful painting, which I can, for those of you looking at this, I can show you on the front of a book called Chartism. Can you see that?
I can, yeah. So it looks like there's a group of people stood on what looks like a rock, and then lots of family, lots of women and children crowded around. There's even a dog in the picture. I can see some flags. So just describing it for those who might just be listening.
Absolutely. So it's a great, community event at the beginning, and that's an early painting. By the time you get to sort of the 1840s, late 1840s, 1850s, politics, and there's a phrase that politics moves indoors. It ceases to be about that, and it becomes about committees meeting in committee rooms and so forth, and that whole sort of late century trade union type thing. And women aren't part of that. So actually, the picture for women over the period 1838 to the 1850s, in terms of politics, actually gets worse.
Well, that's just typical.
Actually, just one other illustration of that. In 1838, the first petition, there were a large number of women signed it. Probably about 1 in 10, 1 in 20 were women. No one blinked an eyelid at this. It was, quite expected, so forth. By the time you get to 1848, where there's attempts to discredit the petition that's drawn up then and presented, one of the grounds for discrediting the petition is, look, there's all these women signing it.
Yeah, I mean, and their opinions are far less credible. I mean, what do they know? They're just busy having babies and doing the housework at home, aren't they? No, I know you've got that real rise of that kind of stereotypical Victorian angel in the house, haven't you? In that kind of develops.
Absolutely,
it's really interesting.
It's a period definitely where women's position goes backwards, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree. So what kind of things were the Chartists doing in order to try and get their charter accepted? So
the first thing is the petitions. The thing that anyone knows about Chartism, if they know anything at all about it, is that they had petitions. In fact, there was a sort of slightly acidic comment that in 1848, where the rest of Europe had revolutions, the English organised a petition, which there's some truth to, although it's a bit more complicated than that. But
I
actually,
think that kind of follows through to today, really, doesn't it? Just do it. Yeah.
In fact, I've got as well as a cartoon from a French newspaper in 1838, and it has a sort of a radical addressing a crowd in London after the 1848 rally in April in Kennington Common. And basically it translates as him saying, "Comrades, follow me, and then we can all go home for tea." So yeah, to come back to your question, the big thing is petitions, and there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, at the beginning, possibly there were a few people that thought, well, if we get enough petitions, then Parliament will have to act. It will have to change the right to vote and give us democracy and so forth. Most people weren't actually that naive. Most people didn't think that just because lots of people wanted it, it would happen. But petitioning was a great thing because it meant that you had a focus for your campaign. It meant that those who were already committed to it could go out and talk to people and get their support for it, get them in behind it. And it really did sort of achieve that. It created a movement and gave a focus. So you had the unhappiness, the unrest, the anger over here. You had the sort of the radical demands over here. And what things like petitioning did was it channeled one to the other. So it served that useful purpose. There were a number of other things. So while petitioning was the main thing to bring people together, there was how they did stuff, how else they brought things together. And one of the main things there was the Northern Star newspaper, the Chartist newspaper. There was no political party in those days. There was no mass media in the same way that we have it today. The way that you brought together a community of people across the whole country, the only way really was to have this newspaper which week after week after week banged on about Chartism and very little else. Okay. And actually it was tremendously successful and tremendously popular. And for most of its history, it sold more newspapers than anything else apart from the Times. It was the second most widely bought newspaper in the country. And because of the way it was consumed, so lots of people couldn't read and write. Others did use it as a campaigning tool. So you had people reading the paper together collectively. Someone would sit and read out, probably not every little last advert and so on, but sort of the main editorials. Certainly someone would read those out in a beer house or whatever to their mates. So it was a collective thing. So it probably had a bigger readership than anything else. And it told people what was going on. It told people what the arguments were. It reported from the communities. So, it made them feel part of it because they could see that their meeting that they had the week before last was now in here along with everybody else's. So it was a really successful tool.
I think that's really interesting that in a time when the majority of people that might have been interested in Chartism couldn't necessarily read or write, that a newspaper was the thing that that bound them together, and that kind of active community of reading something aloud. Actually, it's really interesting. So what did they do at the rallies exactly? What exactly was a rally?
Monster meetings, as they called them, popular phrase at the time, monster meetings. So essentially, what's happened ever since at giant meetings is the leaders stood up, usually on the back of a sort of horse-drawn carriage, from which presumably they detached the horses first, and addressed the crowds. But these often followed processions from one place to the next. So the big one, the best known one, April 1848, Kennington Common in South London. So the procession there started off first thing in the morning. There were two huge horse-drawn carriages at the front, one of them carrying the members of the executive, the leadership of the movement, the second one carrying the petition itself, and they set off from their head office or their offices in up just off Oxford Street, down through London, picking up other smaller groups, other smaller marches from different parts of London as they went over the Thames, picking up another great huge crowd of people at the Elephant Castle, and down south to Kennington Common. And when they got there, as I say, they set up this central speaking point for the leadership to address the crowd. One thing to remember in those days, of course, no loudspeakers.
Oh yeah.
So unless you were right in close, there was very little you could hear. But we know, for example, that at Kennington, certainly there was a second subsidiary speaking area, if you like. And one of the big contingents that had joined the Kennington rally were Irish nationalists seeking the repeal of the Act of Union, which, you think about it, was only 1801. It wasn't that long before all this happened that the UK and Ireland had come together. That group had another speaking platform on the other side of the Common. So there is a photograph and you can see different clumps of people in different places. Because if you weren't close enough, you weren't going to hear anything. You might as well have gone home, frankly. But people were there. There were banners, there were flags flying. It must have been a tremendous event to be at. Bands playing, and you can imagine the cacophony of a great huge crowd or great huge procession going through central London, with not one but numerous bands playing probably different tunes at different places along the procession.
Yeah, it makes you realise how easy it could be for somebody's message to be misconstrued or miscommunicated, or almost like China, that old expression, Chinese whispers. Because if you can't hear the speaker perfectly, and then perhaps you've got other people in the crowd telling you what he's saying because they can hear better, but they're also putting their interpretation, their own words on that. They're not sat there verbatim saying exactly what they're saying.
Yeah.
So that's
it's like the sort of Monty Python and the Life of Brian thing with the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the cheesemakers.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what was the government's response to the Chartists and to these big rallies? What did they think of it, and what did they do?
Well, they weren't very keen, put it that way.
Funnily enough.
Funnily enough. Things evolve over time. So in 1838, 1839, once they're getting to the stage, this is towards the end of the collecting of signatures for the first petition, they have a convention in London, in central London. And there's all sorts of debate going on there about what the role of the convention is. Is it purely about sort of the admin side of organising the petition and getting it into Parliament? Is it about organising what happens next when, as they expect, Parliament rejects the petition? Or is it about being a Parliament in exile? Essentially, they've been elected by more people than Parliament. So there is this argument that, well, surely we are the people who should be governing the country, not this lot. So there is this debate goes on. When the petition gets to Parliament, essentially it's just rejected, completely out of hand. In fact, they don't vote to reject the petition; they vote to reject the idea of listening to it. They don't. They don't even get as far as debating the petition. The only debate is about whether or not they should hear it, and they decide not, and they say no, off you go. So
Can I just pause you just there for 1 second? I can just see in the background that my toddler is climbing on top of the sofa, so I'm just going to ask her dad to take her out so that I can
no problem.
concentrate. Thank you. 1 sec. Sorry, we had a good run.
Yeah.
Before I had to take her out. You have to rewind.
So Parliament decides not just to reject the petition, it decides to reject the whole idea of even discussing it. It's not even going to get as far as discussing what's in it. It just says, no, we're not interested in hearing it.
Can you imagine them doing that now? Can you imagine getting a petition and saying, actually, we're not even going to read it. We're not even going to listen to you. It's crazy.
This petition had 1.3 million people who'd signed it. At the time, there were something like, I think, 700, 800,000 people with the right to vote. So this was considerably more people than were even entitled to vote for Parliament.
And how many men were there in the population at that time, roughly?
About 6 million. So
wow.
You know,
Wow.
you're getting onto a quarter of the entire male population of the UK having signed this petition, which is incredible. So the Chartist Assembly moves off to Birmingham to continue its deliberations. And while it's there, there's all sorts of things going on. So you do get some rioting in Birmingham around the Bull Ring there. And the police are brought in not just from Birmingham, but police are shipped up from London on the new railways to come and deal with this. And lots of people are arrested there, including William Lovett, who's the person who wrote the charter in the first place, and who, I mean, to be honest, is one of the most peaceable men you could ever have met. But you know, no, he was arrested for incitement and so forth. You also get behind the scenes, and it's really, even now, you know, nearly 200 years later, it's not clear who knew what and who was doing what. But it seems fairly clear that there were some people who were attempting to organise an insurrection of some sort, coordinated across the country. So, you know, there would have been risings in different towns and cities to seize the town centres and the important buildings and so forth. The only place that actually goes ahead is in Newport in South Wales, the Newport Rising,
Okay.
which ends in disaster, not least because, you know, it's been called off everywhere else, but for whatever reason they go on with it, and you get these vast columns of men marching on the town of Newport in torrential rain. It's an absolute miserable experience getting there in the first place. When they do get there, some of them, I think at least 20 men, are shot down by the army.
Wow.
So that was pretty much the end of that insurrection.
Is that so? Were the government, bearing in mind a lot of Europe had various revolutions, you know, France, for example, was pretty close to home.
Yeah.
Were the government seriously worried that we might have a revolution, that it might end up in some sort of civil war?
They really were, you know, and the army was on alert, and the army was deployed around the country. 1838, things were quite undeveloped. You know, the state wasn't as organised as it would become, partly due to lack of communications and so forth. It was difficult to do. There wasn't the mechanism to organise from the centre. So a lot of the response to Chartism, certainly in 1838, was driven by local authorities, you know, the Lord Lieutenants of the county and so forth, and how they dealt with it. But the net effect was that large numbers of Chartists, particularly the Chartist leadership, were arrested. So the movement was decapitated, taken out of the equation for a while, and not just Lovett, but also Fergus O'Connor, who really was sort of the central mainspring of Chartism for a decade or more. Was also arrested and imprisoned at that time and taken out of circulation. He was the owner of the Northern Star newspaper that we've already talked about. So after 1838, things die down. It resurges again. 1840, actually probably one of the most important developments, although minor at the time. While both Lovett and O'Connor were out of circulation, this group come together and they form something called the National Charter Association. And that was then the main organisation, because there had been no organisation as such.
Okay.
That was the main organisation centrally, nationally, for the rest of the Chartist period. And it's important, it was actually probably the first political party, mass political party, certainly the first working class political party anywhere in the world. You know, the parties before that were just interest groups within Parliament. This was the first time you had this national organised membership organisation across the country, and that became really, really important as an organising thing for the rest of the period. 1842, we get back to another petition. Sorry, there are only 3 petitions in total, so or 3 worth talking about anyway. So 1842 actually is more impressive still than 1838. So 1842, you have the same thing, you have the petitioning and so forth. And actually, where the first petition had got 1.3 million people, The second petition got 3.3 million people.
Wow, that's incredible.
It absolutely is. Half the men in the country signed this petition.
Has it survived?
No. I imagine we'll be, sadly not. I imagine we'll be talking about sources in it where you can look in future. One of the great sadnesses is that none of the petitions have survived. So there are all these millions and millions of names that have been lost. We don't know who they were. I mean, they were presented to Parliament, and I think Parliament in those days essentially used them to fuel the burners, to fuel the sort of heating system, to keep MPs warm through the winter. None of these things have survived, which is really, really sad.
That's such an incredible statistic, because you think of all your ancestors at the time, all the men over, at least the ones over 21, and you think, well, the good chance, there's a 50-50 chance they signed it.
Absolutely.
I hadn't realised it was as high as that. That's incredible.
Yeah, really. I mean, there's obviously different levels of commitment in there. Someone who might just have signed it in the pub, through to someone who spent all day every day on Chartist activities and so forth. There's a whole range of different levels of commitment.
Sure, but I think it shows that I think sometimes we can be lulled into this false sense that working class people just went to work every day, worked really long hours, and had lots of children and then died, and enjoyed some pastimes, enjoyed a bit of bare knuckle fighting, but they just kind of put up with their lot. And I always think that's a bit of a misconception. I don't think people were just sat there moaning and saying, oh, I don't like this very much, but not actually voicing that, even if it was just in the pub with your mates and signing a petition. So I find that really interesting.
I think certainly, by the mid-19th century, people are aware, people do read, people have ideas and discussions and so forth. It's and particularly, you have quite a strong, we talked about the Chartists, the Northern Star, but there is quite a strong sort of print culture by that period, which there hadn't been, certainly in the 18th century on a mass level. And again, you have to go back to the radical campaigns there of the 1820s, where there was a huge campaign against the taxes on knowledge, called this sort of the Stamp Acts, which added sort of 3 or 4 pence or 6 pence or whatever it was at any given time to the price of a newspaper or a magazine or whatever, and effectively took it out of the price range of ordinary people. And getting those taxes on knowledge repealed actually led to this sort of explosion in print culture.
Very dangerous.
Yeah. So 1842, again, another huge petition, even bigger petition, gets presented to Parliament. And there's fantastic stories about it being presented to Parliament. So Fergus O'Connor, who we've mentioned before, probably a great orator, detailed and so forth, probably not his strong point, but a great speaker. And he talks in the Northern Star, one of these things to be read out in the beer house and so forth, about how this petition was taken to Parliament. And he tells us that the petition was so huge it had to be carried on the backs, and there are pictures of 18 stonemasons clad in white. So it must have been a huge thing. So they're carrying great long poles with these boxes in them. It sort of looks like the Ark of the Covenant being carried somewhere. So they take this to Parliament, and the petition, he tells us, is 6 miles long. And funnily enough, you always think this is why it's just a rhetorical device. It's 6 miles long, but actually, I did do some maths. I worked it out because we know the size of the paper that it was printed on, and we know that it was 4 columns of signatures. And if you do a bit of you have to do a bit of guesswork yourself. So if you say, well, okay, let's leave ½ an inch per signature on this paper.
Yeah.
How long would the paper have had to be to accommodate 3.3 million names? And actually, the paper would have been 6 miles long. And actually, if it hadn't been 4 columns, if it had been one under the other, under the other, under the other, it would have been 24 miles long as a petition, which is just incredible. And so, this rhetoric about it's a 6 mile long petition is absolutely right. It tells us that it burst through the doors of the Commons. They had to remove the door frames to get it in. Again, that is true. If you look at the size of the doors, and you look at the pictures of what the petition in its boxes looked like, the only way to get it through was to remove the door jambs and the doors and get it through into the Commons like that. So absolutely incredible scenes.
Yeah, what a wonderful statement to make.
Yeah.
Here we are. This is what we want, you know.
Again, they decided not to bother. Thank you very much, but we don't think we'll do that. So again, the petition is rejected, kicked out entirely. This time you get very similar sorts of response. You do get sort of agitation around the country. There are plans to do things, as there have been in 1839 as well. Other things. So, for example, there's talk of having of boycotting businesses which don't support the charter, things like that. The big thing is something that's called the Sacred Month, which actually what they meant by that was a general strike.
Okay.
And so attempts to organise this. You have to remember, of course, that trade unions were in a relatively undeveloped stage at that point, and weren't necessarily all going to be pro-Chartist anyway, or think that coming out on strike for the Charter was the right thing to do. But certainly in Manchester, or starting in Manchester, you do get this huge general strike that takes place from August on, July, August, and it spreads across the country, so into the potteries, it spreads up to Scotland, and there are outbreaks elsewhere. And at one point, this is known to history as the plug plot, somewhat disparagingly. And the reason it's known as that is because the strikers went from mill to mill, striking out the plugs from the boilers so that they couldn't operate. And they turned out thousands and thousands of workers came out on strike in support of, or in opposition to, pay cuts and in support of the Charter. And at one point, they held Manchester. Manchester was in the hands of the Chartist and trade union leadership. And to do anything, to go anywhere, you had to have a bit of paper from the committee that said this was, this was legitimate and you were allowed to do this.
Wow, really?
Yeah. I mean, it was almost a sort of revolutionary situation,
Yeah. So what did the so I'm thinking back to my A-level history here. So I vaguely remember being told that the government were quite clever in that they tried to separate the party. They tried to appease the middle class people in the party by slowly giving them reforms without giving the majority, in the hope that the middle class fraction, which were probably the more literate, etc., and the more organised, would stop supporting the working classes because they'd got what they wanted. Is that true? Is that just sort of a real massive simplification for A-level history purposes?
Everything's a simplification. But yeah, essentially there was, if you go back to the first petition, 1838, 1839, there was a big middle class support for it, and that particularly focused around Birmingham and the Birmingham Political Union, who had been the driving force behind the 1832 reforms. And there was a lot of sympathy within that group. The Birmingham Political Union was very much a sort of, I say, middle class, it wasn't sort of small shopkeepers and so forth. We're talking bankers and that sort of middle class. Thomas Attwood, in particular, the leader of the Birmingham Political Union, was a Chartist in those days. As that 1838, 1839 into 1839, as they started talking about ulterior measures, other things they could do when the petition got rejected, so gradually those people peeled off and they were not really wanting to be part of this. To be honest, there were some odd motivations anyway. Attwood was really interested in currency reform. But he thought currency reform would solve some of the economic problems, so that there would be less poverty, and that the only way to achieve this currency reform would be to have a democratic system, because rational people, a rational population, would vote for a government which would carry out his currency reforms. So it was a bit of a sort of several steps down the process, and eventually those people peel off from Chartism in 1839. Some of them do become members of parliament. Certainly the reforms to local government as well that are had already been enacted, but were coming into effect. And where towns became incorporated and became cities and so forth, that gave a forum as well for these local elites to have some power and a say in power. It wasn't just about the sort of the old lords of the manor. It was this new rising class of people, and that's essentially what's going on in the 1830s. Whether it's the Reform Act or that, or is that you're seeing a movement in who has power, from the landowners to business, whether that's owning factories or owning banks. So that's what's really going on. And you've got the Chartists knocking on the door and saying, "Let us in." So yeah, they peel away, but it doesn't necessarily have a noticeable impact. As I said, the first petition, 1.3 million people. Some years later, after this middle class support has gone, 3.3 million people. Okay. So it's not as if it suddenly becomes unpopular as a result.
When was the third? You said there were 3 petitions that were important. So could you tell us a little bit about the third petition and how many people signed that?
Yeah, that's some years later, actually. Between 1842, 1848, things are pretty much in the doldrums. It's difficult to keep Chartism going, and actually it gets diverted off a bit into the Chartist land movement. I'll only touch on it briefly, but it's this idea that you can buy land, create small holdings which are big enough that people there have the right to vote, and you solve poverty, you solve the inner city issues and so forth by relocating people to these, and then they're funded by millions of people paying small amounts in.
That's interesting, actually, because you have a lot of people during that period experimenting with ideas around community, don't you? Because you got. I'm just thinking of Robert Owen. Is it Robert Owen? Robert Owens, who has the factory, doesn't he, and creates the sort of community in the factories. Where all the workers live in the houses that he's built and agree to kind of his rules. But the idea is that it'll help them.
Yeah, so it very much draws on Owenism, and obviously a lot of people aren't just Chartists or just Owenites or whatever. They move across. They have radical sympathies, and so they're involved in various different things. So Chartism, Owenism, the cooperative movement, and all these things cross-fertilize, and you get ideas moving between them. And in the case of the sort of Chartist land movement, you've also got the Irish input, this whole sort of history there of smaller peasant farming feeding into that as well. It didn't succeed. It ended in a total and utter disaster for various reasons, partly because there really wasn't the sort of company acts, the company structure in those days to give a sort of legal status to the Chartist Land Company. Okay. And they couldn't get it properly legally registered and things, so there was no real means of providing governance and doing all the things you needed to do. Secondly, because actually, they did launch half a dozen of these land colonies, and they ran for years, and you can still see some of the cottages in places, still there. But most of the people they settled, if you were a factory worker in Manchester and you suddenly got given 4 acres and a cow in Gloucestershire,
happy days.
Happy days, but you really were not equipped to do this, to suddenly create a small holding and dig potatoes and so forth and make a living out of it. So most of them actually gave up in the end. It was worse than living in a city and working in a factory, frankly. But also as well, in some ways it almost looks like a giant pyramid scheme. So you get 100,000 people contribute a shilling each, and maybe 100 of those get a farm, and everybody else has got nothing, and then you get another 100,000 who contribute a shilling. Yeah. So there's you're constantly having to recruit new people to give their shillings, but actually it's only a very few people who get anything out of it at the end. So it was not really very sustainable, but there just wasn't the legal structure for making that work in those days. That sort of filled the gap up till 1848. you get back to towards 1848, and again the economy is going downhill. You've got a lot of poverty and so forth. You've also got a lot of agitation going on all across Europe. 1848, the year of revolutions, so monarchies and governments overthrown all across Europe, and independence movements as well. And that does have an impact here as well. So 1848 comes along, we get another petition. You might think they'd have given up on petitions by now, but again, there's no illusion that they're going to get enough signatures and everybody's going to say, yeah, okay then, and hand them power. It's a means of organising. It's a means of bringing people together and creating this demand and this upsurge.
Yeah, and I suppose, to be fair, what's the alternative? You go on strike and starve. It's not like it's not like there's a benefit system that's supporting people. It's the workhouse and separated from your family, and so there's a lot to lose by supporting.
Absolutely, and it's one of the reasons that Chartism sort of in the end, I think, fades away, is that, well, we've done this, what more can we do? We've tried everything, and there just isn't. The state is stronger than the people are at that stage. Certainly.
Oh, it's so sad.
Yeah. It is. So 1848 comes along. Again, another huge petition, and they want to do what they've done before. They want to have a huge march on Parliament to present this petition, where it will get handed in and all the rest of it. This time, for reasons I'm not entirely clear about, the state does panic a bit more in advance and organise it. Possibly it's just a reflection of the increased centralisation there's been, the better communications, the better state structures, that they're more equipped to deal with this sort of thing than they have been in the past. So essentially, they, on the 10th of April 1848, which is the day it was all due to happen, they'd brought back, some weeks before that, the Duke of Wellington, the now very aged Duke of Wellington, his glory days more than 30 years behind him, at Waterloo, to mastermind the defence of London.
Okay.
And he relocates the royal family to the Isle of Wight. They all get sent off to safety on the Isle of Wight. Buildings are fortified. So you've got the Bank of England is fortified. You've got even the British Museum, which is not just fortified, booby-trapped. So I don't know whether they thought all these people coming from all over the country might fancy a museum trip while they're there. But because as far as I know, there was never any plan whatsoever to do anything with the British Museum. But they sawed through the supports for the main staircase, so that if a crowd had tried to go up it, it would have collapsed. They had people on the roof ready to rain down sort of stones or whatever on attackers.
They don't seem particularly concerned with the safety of the people that might have climbed those stairs.
Oh no, absolutely not. I don't think that came into consideration. There was no health and safety assessment at all.
I mean, what stopped them from just outright firing on the crowd? Because I'm thinking back to the massacre in Peterloo, which is what, 1820s?
1818, yeah, 1819. I beg your pardon. Sorry. That was much more contained. It was a particular. It was, by these standards, it was a smaller crowd, not small by any means. Also, it was in Manchester, not in London, which does have an impact. If it's in the capital, it has an impact. And I think probably, by that stage, even someone like the Duke of Wellington, who was not known for his liberalism and so forth, might have thought twice about the wisdom of attempting to mow down a crowd of several hundred thousand people.
Were they worried it would just incite further riots and further?
They probably were. I think but they had plans to deal with them that didn't necessarily involve that. But having said that, they did call in the army. The army were garrisoned, not in the front line, but further away, to be brought in if necessary. That included bringing up the artillery from Woolwich, so they had cannon on call if necessary. So they hadn't ruled this out. May not have been their favoured course of action, but they hadn't ruled it out. There was something like 60,000 men were signed up as special constables. So in addition to the Metropolitan Police who you had, 60,000 people, including, interestingly enough, the future Emperor Louis Napoleon, who was in Britain at the time as a private citizen, and he signed up as a special constable.
Wow, so actually, if you've got an ancestor that signed up as a special constable during that period, then especially if they were in London, there's a good chance that they attended.
Absolutely, and something else I'll show you, which
you promised me you'd show me this.
I did, and I don't know if you want to describe.
Yeah,
you want me to describe it. It's,
so for anyone listening, I've got to describe Mark's truncheon. So Mark's holding up a police truncheon from when does that date from?
This is, beg your pardon, 1848. It's been subsequently sort of painted on. It's been decorated and painted, and it has the date April 10th, 1848 on it, so, beneath the coat of arms.
Just to describe it for anyone listening, it is a very solid looking piece of wood. I mean, it's nicely decorated with gold leaf, but it looks like it would really hurt you if you got hit by that.
I think it would. It's about,
there's no two ways about
16 inches, about 16 inches long, solid wood with a handle. Subsequently decorated, no doubt, as a commemorative item by one of the special constables who served on the day. So if your ancestor signed up as a special constable for a couple of months in 1848, that would have been the reason. They were there.
I'm going to have to go check mine now. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So there was this enormous sort of preparation for it. Although, in all honesty, the plan had never been, certainly on that day, more than to have a procession which went to Kennington Common and then came back from Kennington Common to Westminster. And again, you look, there are surviving photographs. There are two, I think, that are in the Royal Collection of the crowd at Kennington Common, and you can see kids there, you can see women there. It wasn't intended to be a violent revolution.
Right.
Nonetheless, that was what was prepared for. So I described earlier on that procession down through to Kennington Common. What the Chartists had failed to take account of was, of course, as they crossed the Thames and headed south to Kennington, the authorities closed the bridges. The bridges essentially were choke points. Once you were there, you were stuck there. You couldn't get back to Westminster. Minor failure of planning there, and actually probably a failure of planning that wouldn't have happened 10 years earlier, when there were far more people with military experience in the Chartist movement. People who by this stage were quite old, but had been in militias and been in the militia, been in the Napoleonic Wars and so forth, which had only ended 20 years previously. So you had all those people who had military experience. By this stage, they're probably not really there anymore.
You get this impression of kind of Baldric, don't you? Going, I've got an idea. I've got a cunning plan.
A cunning plan. Definitely.
We'll do another petition.
A slightly flawed cunning plan. Yeah. So what happens on the day is they get there, and so they put these platforms there for the speakers to address the crowds. And before that happens, the Commissioner of Police, who has an outpost, probably in an inn overlooking Kennington Common, I think, not entirely sure where it was, summons the Chartist leadership, O'Connor essentially, to come and talk to him, and he warns him that this rally cannot, this cannot go ahead, this march cannot go ahead. You must tell them to go home, and explains to him all the preparations that have been made, the army on, waiting there to deal with this and so forth. And O'Connor goes back, and his speech, which you can read still in Illustrated London News, actually has a huge report on what happened on the 10th of April 48, and it includes big extracts from his speech, and he tells them that he loves them all and all this sort of stuff. Wonderful people. So
I love you guys.
Love you guys. But that he is there knowing himself that he could be assassinated. He has had threats of this. He's also aware that the preparations that are waiting to deal with this, and he can't tell them to go ahead with what the original plan had been. He couldn't have it on his conscience that if they were shot down, and he knows they wouldn't want it on their consciences if he was shot down. And he was, much loved leader of the movement. It wasn't sort of wasn't a Donald Trump type speech. It was this is genuinely true. People would have been devastated had O'Connor been taken out on that. And there is some tumult in the crowd over this. So William Cuffy, for example, who's the leader of the London Chartists. So leader is a bit of a loaded term in all of this, as that isn't really the same sort of thing. But certainly he was a very prominent figure in London Chartism, and had been its president and so forth. He's one of the first up saying, no, we must press on, we must go and do it, we must take this to Westminster. Cuffy is most famous as the Black Chartist. I mean, he wasn't the only black person involved in Chartism, but he's a really prominent figure and obviously stood out in those days. Wouldn't mind coming back to him in a minute, actually, when we talk about what happens after this day. But for the most part, the crowd does disperse, and the petition itself is taken to Westminster in a couple of hansom cabs by O'Connor and a few others, and there is a bit of a punch up on some of the bridges, but nothing serious. So that day sort of ends in a bit of a damp squib, but it was never really intended to be a big confrontation.
Okay.
What you tend to then get in most histories is that, well, that was the end of Chartism. 10th of April 1848, it all went wrong, the bluff was called, but wasn't quite like that.
So Mark and I ended up so engrossed that we carried on chatting for another half an hour. Mark goes into some fantastic details about the different members of the Chartist movement. For example, Mark Cuffy, who he mentioned earlier. That extra half an hour can be viewed at my Ko-fi store. There's a link in the description. By purchasing that extra half an hour, you're also helping me to continue to produce Twice Removed. So thank you very much in advance.